Welcome to another deep dive. You know what we do here. We take a mountain of research and we boil it down to the good stuff just for you. Today, we are diving into the case of Ronald Gray.
Ronald
He
Gray?
was a former soldier, actually, on death row.
Yes.
And this is not just a true crime story. It's more than that. It brings up questions about justice, law, ethics, all that stuff, all rolled into one.
Definitely. We're going way beyond the surface level here. We're using actual court documents, news reports, psychological evaluations, really getting a full picture of this complex case and everything it means.
It's a long one. So we'll start with Gray's early life and military career. Then we'll get into, the details of his crimes, then unpack all the legal stuff with his trials and appeals. And then finally, we'll look at, the death penalty debate, especially as it relates to the military.
Yeah. So we'll start with Ronald Gray's childhood. Liberty City, Miami.
Mhm.
Grew up in poverty, experienced a lot of trauma. His stepfather was abusive. And, expert testimony really points to this rough upbringing as a factor in his psychology.
Yeah, it makes you think about the cycle of violence. Early experiences can have a huge impact on a person's life. Do you think? Well, do you think this past excuses his actions? Or does it point to the need for intervention programs early on? It's a tough question, but it's an important one.
For sure. Now, let's fast forward. 1984, Gray, 18 years old. He enlists in the Army,
Okay.
stationed at Fort Bragg,
Yeah.
working as a cook,
Yeah.
rank of Specialist 4.
Yeah.
It's it's a strange contrast when you consider the crimes.
It reminds me that these people, perpetrators of violence, they can come from totally normal backgrounds. You wouldn't look at an Army cook and think,
Well, you wouldn't think that.
it breaks the stereotype, and that's something we all have to remember.
Okay, let's get into the crimes now. Gray's first murder was in 1986. The victim was Linda Jean Coates, a 23-year-old student.
Mhm.
And, this is just the beginning. Sadly, it escalated from there. His crimes became more frequent, more violent. A string of abductions, rapes, and murders, mostly targeting young women.
It's heartbreaking going through the list. Tammy Cofer Wilson, Laura Lee Vickery Clay, Kimberly Ann Ruggles. They're not just names on a list. These are people with lives and dreams, families who were devastated. We have to remember that. The human cost.
I agree. It's easy to get lost in the legal details, but the impact on the victims and families is profound.
Like the case of Laura Lee Vickery Clay, 18 years old. Private stationed at Fort Bragg. She was last seen with a man, later identified as Gray, at a Kmart. Imagine the fear when her car was found, seemingly driven through the woods the next day.
Weeks later, they found her body in those same woods at Fort Bragg. She had been raped, sodomized, shot multiple times. And the murder weapon, a .22 caliber pistol stolen by Gray, they found it nearby.
Then there's Kimberly Ann Ruggles, 23, cab driver. She was sent to Gray's address and later found murdered. Raped, sodomized, beaten, stabbed multiple times.
One of the most chilling details is that her mouth, it was gagged with a belt. And that belt matched pants they found at Gray's place. The details, they point to the cruelty, the premeditation. It wasn't just killing. It was the level of violence he inflicted.
It's horrifying. But thankfully, forensic evidence, fingerprints, footprints that connected Gray to the crimes. And we can't forget Marianne Lang Namath, 19 years old, a private. She survived one of Gray's attacks.
And she identified him? That was huge. Lot of courage there. To face the person who attacked you, her testimony was critical.
Okay, now here's where the legal stuff gets interesting. Because Gray committed crimes both on and off base, he was tried in both civilian and military courts.
Yeah, dual prosecution. Two separate court systems, basically. You had the civilian courts
Yeah.
and then the military courts, which have their own rules.
In the civilian court, the charges against Gray, there were a lot. Second-degree murder, burglary, rape, sexual assault, kidnapping, robbery, it goes on. Shows the extent of his crimes. He got 8 life sentences, 3 of them consecutive.
And then the military court-martial at Fort Bragg. He was found guilty there, too. Premeditated murder, attempted murder, rape, robbery, forcible sodomy. The sentence, death.
He was only 22 when he was sentenced. Hard to believe someone so young could do such awful things. Makes you think about accountability, rehabilitation, the meaning of justice.
It's a big debate. Can someone that young truly understand what they've done? Can they be redeemed, even in a case like this? Tough questions, no easy answers.
And the story doesn't end there. This conviction set off a legal battle that lasted decades. We'll get into the appeals process and the controversy over Gray's death sentence right after this. We were talking about Ronald Gray's conviction in both civilian and military courts. So what happened next?
A long appeals process. Decades, really. Like a legal thriller, all the twists and turns.
So Gray appealed his sentence.
Oh, yeah.
Multiple times.
In 2008, President George W. Bush actually approved his execution.
Wow.
It would have been the first execution by the U.S. military since 1961. Huge decision. Put the military death penalty right in the spotlight.
Must have been a ton of pressure on everyone involved. Not just a legal decision, but a historical one, too. Taking a life, even someone who did terrible things, it's heavy stuff.
Right before the execution, a federal judge issued a stay, gave Gray a reprieve, sent the case back into the legal system.
One judge's decision changed everything. What were the main arguments from both sides?
That led to the stay.
Gray's lawyers said there were problems with his defense in the original trial, evidence that wasn't looked at properly. Of course, the prosecution said the trial was fair, the evidence was clear, the judge looked at everything and granted the stay. Execution was on hold.
So it wasn't an easy decision, real legal questions that needed answers.
Definitely. It shows how the justice system, it tries to be fair, but it's complex and slow.
So what happened after the stay?
More appeals. Each one going to a higher military court, like climbing a ladder, each court reviewing what the lower courts decided.
Sounds exhausting. It is. 2012, the Army Court of Criminal Appeals denied his request for relief. Then, 2017, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Armed Forces, that's the highest military court, they rejected his appeal too.
So even with all these appeals, he was losing at every level. It sounds like he was running out of options.
Yeah, his last chance was the Supreme Court.
The highest court in the land. Did they take the case?
No. In 2018, they decided not to hear it. A big blow for Gray. Basically the end of the road for his appeals. He's still on death row.
It really shows the power of the Supreme Court. Their decision is final. And it reminds me of something we talked about before, how rare the death penalty is in the military. Can you tell us more about that?
Sure. The death penalty in the military, it's not common at all. Makes Gray's case even more unique. And because it's so rare, there are a lot of debates, ethical debates, legal debates, especially when you compare military justice to civilian courts.
It makes sense. The military has its own set of rules, its own way of doing things. What are some of the key differences in how they approach capital punishment?
One big difference is that in the military, the president has to sign off on the execution. That doesn't happen in civilian cases. There, it's the courts that decide.
So it adds another layer of checks and balances.
Right. It's part of how military justice works. The president, as commander-in-chief, is ultimately responsible for what happens in the military.
It makes you think about the arguments for and against the death penalty, especially within the military. What do people say in support of it?
Some argue that it prevents other service members from committing serious crimes. Like a deterrent, it sends a message. Certain actions, like murder or treason, are completely unacceptable in the military.
So it's about keeping order, maintaining discipline.
Exactly. They also see it as a just punishment for certain crimes.
Yeah.
Crimes that violate the core values of the military. Things like loyalty, duty, honor.
And some people argue it gives the victims' families a sense of closure, of justice.
Right. It's a way to balance the scales, to acknowledge the pain and suffering caused by the crime. But of course, there's another side to this debate. Many people have strong concerns about the death penalty, particularly in a military setting.
Yeah, what are those concerns?
Some believe it's simply cruel and inhumane, no matter the crime. It violates basic human rights. No state, even in war or in military courts, should have that power over life and death.
It's a moral argument. Taking a life is wrong, even if it's for justice.
Exactly. They also worry about mistakes, wrongful convictions. The justice system, it tries to be fair, but it's not perfect. And with the death penalty, there's no going back.
And is the death penalty always applied fairly? Some people say that it disproportionately affects minority service members or those who can't afford good lawyers.
That's an important point. We have to look at whether the death penalty is applied equally across all groups in the military. Are certain groups more likely to get the death penalty? And if so, why? These are questions that need answers.
It's complicated, that's for sure. Strong arguments on both sides. There are no easy answers here.
It's a debate that's gone on for centuries. No simple solution. It comes down to your beliefs, your values, how you weigh things like justice, mercy, the value of human life.
Maybe this is a good time for our listeners to reflect on these questions. We've covered a lot of ground here. The facts of the case, the trials, the appeals, the arguments about the death penalty in the military.
We'll wrap things up in the last part of the deep dive. We'll talk about the victims, the families, and the impact these crimes have had. And we'll leave you with some final thoughts to consider.
We're back. This deep dive has been heavy. The Ronald Gray case, it's easy to get lost in the legal stuff, the death penalty arguments, but the real heart of this story is the people.
Yeah, we can't forget the victims. Linda Jean Coates, Tammy Cofer Wilson, Laura Lee Vickery Clay, Kimberly Ann Ruggles. These were real people, daughters, sisters, friends. Their lives were cut short, and the people they left behind are still dealing with that loss.
It's a reminder. Behind every crime, every court case, there are people hurting. And it goes beyond the victims themselves, right?
Of course, their families, decades of pain and grief, and the legal process just drags on. Imagine every appeal, every hearing, every delay. It brings everything back. It's got to be agonizing.
Trying to find justice, but it takes so long. It's a hard balance.
It is. And we can't forget Marianne Lang-Namath. She survived Gray's attack. She faced him, testified against him. That took incredible courage.
She's so strong to overcome something so horrible. It gives me hope, even in a case this dark.
It does. So we've reached the end of our deep dive, and we're left with a big question. What do you think about the death penalty, especially in the military?
It's such a complicated issue. It makes you think about morality, justice, the role of the government. It's more than just the law. It's about our values, how we respond to these awful acts.
An eye for an eye. Or do we believe in rehabilitation, second chances,
Yeah.
even for people who have done terrible things?
And what if we're wrong? The justice system isn't perfect. What if an innocent person is executed? There's no going back. These are hard questions, no easy answers.
That's the whole point. We're not here to tell you what to think. We want you to think for yourself. Talk about these issues.
This case, Ronald Gray, it's shown us a lot.
Yeah.
About military justice, about the death penalty, about the impact of these crimes on everyone involved.
We hope you keep learning about this case. The legal side, the ethics, the human stories.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.